The bridge did not collapse all at once. It bent slowly, as if thinking about it, the river pressing harder with every minute of rain, dark water thick with branches and torn leaves. And when Daniel Reed stepped back, he felt the ground shift under his boots. Not sliding yet, just softening, just loosening. And somewhere beyond the fog, a tree cracked like a rifle shot, close enough to matter, far enough to be invisible. And that was when he understood they were no longer hiking out. They were being measured by the mountain. September 18th, 1968. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee. The rain had already been falling for 30 hours when Daniel Reed realized the sound had changed. It was no longer soft on the canopy, but sharp against the rock, harder, faster, as if the sky had decided to empty itself all at once. The remnants of a tropical system pushing inland and stalling over the Appalachians, dumping inches of water into narrow valleys that had nowhere to send it. And Daniel stood on a narrow rise with his 14-year-old son, Caleb, staring at the wooden footbridge they had crossed that morning, now shuddering under a river that had doubled in width, brown and violent, carrying branches, logs, entire pieces of the forest past them like evidence of something breaking upstream. He said they would wait, because waiting sounded calm and reasonable, because panic would only waste strength. But the ground beneath them was already softening, their boots sinking a fraction deeper with every minute. The trail behind had turned into a ribbon of moving mud. The trail ahead ended at the river, and the map in Daniel's pocket suddenly felt like a relic from a drier world. Caleb tried to joke about earning a better story for school, but his voice cracked halfway through and both of them heard it. Heard the thinness, the way fear creeps into the throat before it reaches the mind. And somewhere across the valley, a tree snapped, not falling yet, just warning. The bridge gave way without drama, one beam twisting, one support tearing loose, the whole structure folding into the current as if it had been waiting for permission. And Caleb stepped back too quickly, his heels sliding on wet leaves, Daniel catching his jacket with both hands and pulling him upright. The motion clumsy, desperate, too close to failure. And for a moment they stood chest to chest, breathing hard, staring at the empty space where their return path had been, the rain flattening their hair against their foreheads, running into their eyes. And Daniel understood something that felt like a weight pressing down on his ribs. No one knew exactly where they were. Not precisely. Not enough to come quickly. They climbed higher, not because they had a plan, but because water always chooses the lowest ground. And the lowest ground was now a threat, each step deliberate, each route tested before trusting it, their packs heavier with soaked fabric. Their food limited to what they had meant for a simple overnight hike. Crackers sealed in wax paper, 2 apples, 3 small bottles of water already half gone. Daniel calculating without speaking, dividing supplies in his head while Caleb scanned the trees as if expecting them to move. And twice the slope shifted under their weight, soil peeling away in shallow slides that exposed slick clay beneath, reminding them that the mountain was not solid today, it was changing shape. By late afternoon, the fog thickened, not gentle but suffocating, swallowing distance so completely that 10 yards ahead looked like the end of the world, the rain relentless, the air cooling as the storm settled deeper into the range. And Daniel found a narrow shelf of rock above the swelling creek, just wide enough for the two of them to sit without sliding. Not safe, only less exposed. And as they crouched there listening to the roar below grow louder with every passing hour, Caleb asked the question Daniel had been avoiding. How long can a river keep rising? And Daniel did not answer right away, because the honest answer was the one he could not afford to say aloud. The rain did not ease during the night. It intensified, drumming against the narrow rock shelf until sleep became impossible, and Daniel understood that exhaustion would become their quiet enemy, more dangerous than the river if they let it take control. So he kept Caleb talking in low, steady sentences about school, about the old truck waiting at the trailhead, about ordinary things that felt unreal now, because below them the creek had swollen into a churning corridor of brown force, swallowing trees at its edges, clawing at the banks with a sound like fabric tearing, and sometime before dawn, a section of hillside across the water gave way in a long, sliding sigh. Not a violent crash, but a steady collapse of earth surrendering to saturation. When gray light finally filtered through the fog, it revealed something worse than darkness. It showed the extent of the change. The trail they had climbed yesterday was no longer visible, erased by runoff, replaced by streaks of raw clay and exposed roots hanging like broken ribs from the slope. And Caleb stared at it in silence, calculating the same truth Daniel had reached hours earlier. They could not descend safely, not without risking a slide straight into the torrent below, and staying where they were meant limited water, limited food, limited time. The air colder now, their clothes heavy with damp that would not dry under this sky. Daniel rationed the first apple into thin, deliberate slices, handing Caleb the larger half without comment, pretending not to notice when his son tried to split it back evenly, the gesture almost causing an argument until Daniel forced a quiet smile and said, strength mattered more than fairness, and they both understood the lie, but accepted it because it sounded like leadership. Then they inventoried again. 2 bottles of water between them, less than before because thirst had crept in unnoticed during the night, and the creek below. Endless water they could not safely reach without risking a fall on the slick descent. By mid-morning, the fog thinned just enough to reveal movement along the ridge above. Not human, only branches shifting under runoff. But the illusion of possibility made Caleb stand and wave once before realizing no one could see them. And Daniel felt a surge of anger at the isolation, at the knowledge that the storm system had flooded roads across eastern Tennessee, that rescue crews would be stretched thin even if someone reported them missing, and he fought the urge to shout into the valley because shouting wastes breath and hope must be conserved like food. Around noon, the shelf began to drip from above, water finding new seams in the rock, turning their narrow refuge into something temporary, unstable. And Daniel traced the slope with his eyes, searching for higher ground, spotting a jagged outcrop perhaps 30 yards upslope, reachable only by crossing a stretch of mud that looked deceptively firm, and he felt the decision forming. Stay and risk slow encroachment, or climb and risk immediate failure. And when Caleb met his gaze without speaking, Daniel realized the boy was waiting not for safety, but for certainty, and certainty was the one thing the mountain would not provide. Daniel chose to climb, not because it felt safe, but because staying meant watching the shelf dissolve beneath them, inch by inch. And he told Caleb to move slowly, to test every patch of ground with the side of his boot before trusting it with weight. The mud looked firm, yet trembled under pressure, a thin crust floating on saturated earth. And as they angled toward the jagged outcrop, the rain shifted direction, blown sideways by a sudden gust that carried the smell of torn soil and crushed leaves, the kind of smell that follows fresh damage. And halfway across the slope, Caleb's foot sank deeper than expected, not sliding at first, but sticking, held by suction that refused to release. Daniel lunged forward on instinct, grabbing his son's wrist before balance tipped completely, and the motion pulled his own boots free from secure footing, both of them frozen for a breathless second, in a position that felt suspended between decision and disaster. The mud beneath Caleb's trapped leg beginning to move not downward, but sideways. A slow creep that meant the entire section of hillside was loosening, and Daniel spoke in a low voice that sounded calm only because he forced it to, instructing Caleb to lean forward, to shift weight gradually, to avoid sudden force that would trigger a slide, and together they counted to 3 before pulling upward in controlled unison. The suction released with a sickening slurp, Caleb stumbling into Daniel's chest, both of them dropping to their knees as a ribbon of earth slid past where his leg had been seconds earlier, flowing downhill in a narrow stream that gathered speed and disappeared into the roar below. And neither spoke for several moments because the realization was too sharp, too immediate. They were not navigating stable terrain, but something temporarily pretending to be solid, and the outcrop above no longer looked like a destination. It looked like a gamble with no margin. Still they climbed, slower now, spacing each step as if walking across thin ice, though there was no ice anywhere in sight. Only saturated clay and exposed roots, slick as wire. And when they finally reached the jagged rock, Daniel pulled Caleb onto it first, then followed, their chests heaving, fingers numb from gripping stone, and from that slightly higher vantage point they saw what the fog had concealed earlier. The creek had spread beyond its banks into the forest, transforming familiar ground into braided channels of moving water, isolating pockets of land into temporary islands that would not remain islands for long. Caleb spotted something downstream, a shape wedged between two trees at the edge of the current, and for a fleeting second hope flashed across his face, a sign, a marker, perhaps even part of a ranger structure. But as the fog shifted, they saw it clearly. It was only a section of trail sign torn loose, the painted letters half submerged, spinning slowly in an eddy before breaking free and vanishing around a bend. And Daniel felt the weight of that image settle inside him, not as despair yet, but as understanding. The mountain was dismantling human order piece by piece, and they were still inside it, still moving upward with no guarantee that higher ground would remain higher for long. The outcrop felt solid at first, a spine of rock resisting the softening world around it. But by late afternoon, Daniel noticed thin streams of water tracing new paths along its surface, slipping through cracks that had been dry hours earlier. And he realized the mountain was not simply flooding below. It was absorbing and releasing at every level, reshaping itself from the inside. Caleb sat with his knees pulled close, scanning the shifting valley, counting the seconds between distant cracks of splitting timber as if measuring how much forest remained upright. And the rain, still steady, began to feel less like weather and more like pressure applied without pause. They needed water, the irony almost cruel, surrounded by movement yet rationing sips from plastic bottles warmed by their hands. And Daniel made the decision to descend slightly along the rock face where runoff collected in a shallow groove, using his bandana to absorb the clearer trickle before wringing it into a bottle cap, repeating the motion with slow patience, knowing contamination was possible, yet dehydration certain if they did nothing. Caleb watching every movement with a seriousness that did not belong to 14, and when Daniel handed him the first diluted mouthful, the boy nodded without speaking, accepting risk as part of survival without complaint. A sudden tremor passed through the rock beneath them, subtle but undeniable. Not an earthquake, but the vibration of something large giving way nearby. And seconds later, a section of trees upridge tilted in uneasy unison, their roots exposed like pulled threads, before sliding downward in a grinding cascade that stopped short of the creek, yet erased any possibility of retreat in that direction. Daniel's breath catching as he calculated distances, angles, escape paths that no longer existed, the landscape tightening around them not with speed, but with deliberate inevitability. Caleb pointed toward the ridge crest, where the fog thinned enough to reveal a narrow spine leading higher, steeper, and more exposed, but perhaps beyond the saturated layers threatening collapse below. And Daniel weighed the cost. The climb would drain what little strength remained, yet staying meant trusting rock that was beginning to seep from within, and he felt anger rise at himself for underestimating the storm system, for believing forecasts were suggestions rather than warnings. Anger sharp enough to cut through fear, pushing him toward action because motion, even dangerous motion, felt preferable to waiting for the ground to decide for them. As twilight approached, the rain finally weakened, not stopping but easing into a thin, relentless drizzle. And for a brief, fragile hour, the forest seemed to pause. No new collapses, no cracking trunks, only the steady rush below and their own breathing. And Daniel almost allowed hope to surface, almost believed the worst had passed, until he noticed the creek no longer roaring but humming deeper, wider. Its tone changed by increased volume rather than speed, and he understood with cold clarity that the water rising in the valley had not yet reached its peak. It was still gathering somewhere beyond sight, and when it arrived, it would test every choice they had made so far. They began the climb toward the ridge crest before full dark, because night on unstable ground would turn hesitation into danger, and Daniel told Caleb to keep 3 points of contact at all times, 2 hands and 1 foot or 2 feet, and 1 hand. No sudden shifts, no pride in speed. The slope steeper now, carved by runoff into narrow gullies that forced them to zigzag across slick clay and jutting stone, and the drizzle carried a chill that crept through soaked fabric, stealing warmth gradually, not enough to shock, but enough to weaken. And halfway up, Caleb slipped again, not into a slide this time, but into a hard impact against rock that knocked the breath from him and left him gasping, eyes wide with the kind of fear that arrives when air refuses to return. Daniel crouched beside him, steadying his shoulders, speaking slowly until the breathing evened, checking ribs with careful pressure, relieved to find pain but not fracture. And for a moment he considered stopping entirely, building some fragile shelter from branches and packs. But the ridge above felt closer than before, visible now as a dark line cutting against the fading sky, and he knew that lower ground was still surrendering behind them. So he helped Caleb upright and they moved again, slower, each step negotiated as if asking permission from the mountain itself. At the crest, the wind met them with unexpected force, not violent but insistent, sweeping fog aside in thin layers and revealing a narrow spine of earth no wider than a road shoulder, dropping steeply on both sides into shadowed forest and flood. And from this vantage, Daniel saw something that tightened his throat. The valley floor had transformed into a broad, shifting sheet of brown water reflecting what little light remained. The creek no longer a line, but a presence, occupying everything below, and scattered debris circled in slow rotations, evidence that the peak flow had not yet finished arriving. They followed the ridge cautiously, seeking a stand of older trees whose deeper roots might anchor firmer ground. And Caleb asked the question that had been building for hours, whether anyone would know they were still inside the park after the storm warnings, whether rangers would search trails cut off by washouts. And Daniel answered honestly this time, saying he did not know, that floods stretched resources thin, that roads into the mountains might be closed for days, and the word days hung between them heavier than the rain ever had. As darkness settled fully, the drizzle intensified again, fine and relentless, and they found a cluster of thick trunks intertwined near the ridge bend, the soil there less saturated, shielded by roots gripping stone beneath, and Daniel decided this would be their position for the night. Not safe but defensible, not dry but stable. And as they arranged their packs against the wind and leaned back against bark slick with moisture, Caleb whispered that he could still hear the water rising even from this height, and Daniel listened carefully, realizing the sound had changed once more, deeper and closer than before, as if the flood was climbing the mountain step by step, unwilling to leave them untouched. The night did not bring rest. It brought sound, low and constant, the kind that seeps into thought until it feels like part of the body. And Daniel understood that the water below was no longer confined to the valley floor. It was spreading into side ravines, climbing toward the ridgeline in quiet increments. And sometime after midnight, a new noise joined the flood, a hollow knocking that echoed through the trees, steady and irregular, as if something heavy was striking wood again and again. And Caleb whispered that it sounded deliberate, that it sounded like someone signaling. But Daniel knew better. It was debris caught in current, hammering against trunks in the dark. The wind shifted before dawn, warmer now, carrying the metallic scent of saturated soil and broken roots, and Daniel felt the ridge tremble beneath them, subtle but present. Not a sharp jolt, but a rolling adjustment as water redistributed weight within the slopes below, and he placed his palm against the ground to feel it more clearly, sensing vibration that did not belong to wind alone. Caleb watching him closely, reading his face for reassurance, and Daniel forced himself to nod once, slow and controlled. even though the movement in the earth suggested that the storm's real consequence had not yet finished unfolding. When gray light returned, it revealed a narrow channel cutting across the ridge 30 yards ahead, water pouring from one side to the other in a thin but fast stream, a new formation that had not existed hours earlier, proof that even high ground was being carved into pathways for runoff. And Daniel realized the ridge itself could fracture if enough water collected along its spine, splitting into separate sections that might slide in opposite directions, and the image formed vividly in his mind, the earth beneath them dividing without warning, leaving no stable footing at all. Caleb's hands shook when he tried to open the last bottle of water, and Daniel saw not weakness but depletion. The boy had been bracing against fear for too long, and now hunger and cold were eroding the thin layer of resolve he had maintained. So Daniel made another quiet decision. He would not allow despair to enter openly, not while they could still move. And he told Caleb they would follow the ridge northward, seeking a higher knoll he had glimpsed through thinning fog the previous evening, a point that might remain above whatever surge was still gathering below. They rose stiffly, muscles tight from hours of cold contact with bark and stone, and began edging along the narrow crest, careful to avoid the new water channel slicing across their path, stepping over it where rock anchored the soil. And as they moved, the knocking sound returned. Louder now, closer, not from the valley but from the slope just beyond sight. And Daniel felt the shift before he saw it, a slow sag in the trees to their right, roots beginning to pull free in unison, the ground there no longer gripping but releasing, and he knew that whatever was moving beneath the surface was finally reaching the ridge itself. The ridge did not fail all at once. It began with a tilt so slight Daniel thought it was fatigue, a dizziness from hunger and cold. But then the trees to their right leaned further, roots lifting from the soil in a slow, terrible reveal, earth peeling back in a widening seam that ran parallel to their path. And he grabbed Caleb's arm without thinking, pulling him toward the higher side of the crest as the ground behind them sagged and folded, not collapsing into a roar, but sliding in a grinding motion that seemed almost deliberate, as if the mountain were adjusting its own posture and they were inconvenient weight. They ran then, not recklessly but with urgent calculation, placing each step ahead of the moving line, staying on the narrow band of firmer soil that had not yet begun to shear. And Caleb's breathing turned sharp and uneven, fear now physical, tangible, and Daniel felt his own pulse hammering against the inside of his ears, the sound blending with the distant flood below. And when the sliding section finally tore free, it moved faster than expected, carrying several trees with it in a downward sweep that vanished into fog, leaving behind a jagged scar only yards from where they had been standing moments before. They did not stop running until the ridge widened slightly near the knoll Daniel had mentioned, a rise reinforced by exposed rock that protruded through thinner soil, and there they dropped to their knees, not from weakness but from the need to feel something stable beneath their palms, the rock cold yet immovable. And Caleb stared back at the torn section of ridge with a stunned expression, realizing how narrow the margin had been, how close the earth itself had come to taking them without warning. And Daniel knew that this was the kind of moment that changes a person, when safety reveals itself as temporary and conditional. The rain lightened again, almost mockingly, as if offering a pause after violence. And through thinning fog, Daniel saw the valley below transformed into a wide basin of moving water, its surface no longer chaotic but heavy and continuous. And he noticed something else. Debris had begun to collect against the base of the ridge in a thick, slow-moving mass, branches and trunks forming a crude barrier that altered the current's direction, forcing part of the flood to bend toward the very slope they occupied, and the realization tightened his chest. The water was not simply passing through. It was redirecting, searching new channels. Caleb followed his gaze and understood without explanation. The knoll that felt secure might become isolated if the redirected flow carved deeper into the slope beneath them, turning their refuge into a narrowing peninsula of mud and rock. And Daniel weighed options that were shrinking by the hour. Higher ground lay farther along the ridge but required crossing exposed sections that might already be compromised. Staying meant trusting that the rock foundation extended deep enough to resist undermining. And as the wind shifted once more, carrying the low, relentless hum of rising water closer than before, Daniel realized the mountain had not finished testing them. It was only changing tactics. Daniel decided they could not remain on the knoll, not after seeing the debris dam forming below, because if the redirected water undercut the slope even slightly, the rock base would become an island with nothing anchoring the soil around it, and isolation meant no retreat at all. So he pointed along the ridge toward a darker rise barely visible through lifting fog, higher, steeper, perhaps the last elevation point before the land sloped down toward another valley. And Caleb did not argue this time. He simply adjusted the straps on his soaked pack and nodded, fear no longer loud, but settled into something colder and more focused. They moved carefully across a section of ridge that had narrowed to little more than a raised seam between two unstable faces. The ground there cracked in thin lines that spidered outward from saturated pockets, and Daniel instructed Caleb to step only where rock protruded through the mud, ignoring the tempting smooth areas that might conceal hollow space beneath. And halfway across they heard a new sound. Not water, not trees splitting, but a deep shifting pressure like air escaping from underground, and the earth to their left sagged in a slow ripple, not sliding immediately but preparing to, as if the slope were inhaling before collapse. Daniel shoved Caleb forward with a force that surprised them both, urgency replacing caution for a single decisive second, and the ground where they had just been standing folded downward, not violently but with a terrible patience, a slab of earth rotating into the void below, leaving behind a jagged trench that widened as they watched. And Caleb stumbled onto firmer stone while Daniel scrambled after him, boots slipping, fingers digging into exposed roots that strained but held, and when he finally pulled himself clear, the ridge behind them looked thinner, diminished, as if the mountain were shaving itself away piece by piece. They reached the darker rise just as the drizzle thickened again, and from this slightly higher vantage Daniel could see beyond the immediate flood zone to a distant slope where a narrow fire road cut through the trees, barely visible yet unmistakable, a human line in a reshaped landscape, and the sight struck him with equal parts hope and dread. Hope because it meant access if they could reach it, dread because the descent from their current position would require crossing terrain already weakened by continuous runoff. And Caleb followed his gaze, eyes narrowing as he measured the distance in silence. The hum of water deepened once more, and when Daniel looked back toward the debris dam, he saw it begin to shift, the mass of trapped trunks and branches trembling under pressure, one section lifting slightly as if buoyed from beneath, and he understood what that meant. When it released, the surge would not be gradual. It would travel outward in a sudden redistribution, testing every slope and ravine below, including the path they would need to descend. And for the first time since the storm began, he felt not just fear, but a racing urgency that bordered on panic, because whatever decision they made next would unfold under a moving wall of force already preparing to break free. The debris dam did not explode. It dissolved, and the moment it did, the flood surged sideways with a weight that felt personal, striking the base of the ridge and sending a deep vibration through the ground under Daniel's boots. Not sharp, but rolling, as if something massive had shifted beneath them. And Caleb froze when the soil ahead of them sagged visibly, cracking in a jagged seam that widened with slow inevitability, not fast enough to outrun without thinking, not slow enough to ignore. Daniel grabbed his son and redirected their descent toward a thinner band of exposed stone, but the slope beneath them had already begun to rearrange itself, water cutting channels across their path, small streams intersecting and widening, and halfway down a section of ground ahead folded inward, creating a shallow trench that deepened as they watched, the flood below now pressing into every weakness, searching for entry points. And Daniel understood with cold clarity that the ridge was being undercut from both sides. They tried to traverse left, But a second tremor rolled through the hillside, stronger this time, and a slab of earth broke loose 10 yards away, sliding downward in a heavy grinding motion that erased what had been their alternative route. And Caleb's breathing turned ragged, not from panic, but from exhaustion. His legs slower now, his balance uncertain, and Daniel felt the terrible arithmetic forming in his mind. Distance remaining versus strength fading, time shrinking while the mountain accelerated its decisions. By the time they reached the lower slope, the flood had already claimed the ground directly below, the thin crossing strip gone entirely, replaced by a churning cut of brown water moving too fast and too wide to attempt. And Daniel stopped abruptly, staring at the gap where their path should have been, the fire road visible beyond it, yet unreachable. And for the first time since the storm began, he felt something close to despair press hard against his chest. Not loud, not dramatic, but heavy and rational. The ridge behind them shifted again, not collapsing yet, but settling, lowering by inches as saturation continued, and Daniel realized with sudden clarity that they were trapped between a rising flood and a failing slope. No stable descent, no retreat, and Caleb looked at him without speaking, waiting for instruction that Daniel did not yet have. The sound of water growing deeper, closer, as if the mountain were closing its hands slowly around the space they occupied. Daniel scanned the slope above and spotted the only remaining possibility. A fallen pine lodged diagonally between two outcrops, its trunk bridging part of the widening cut below, not stable, not designed for crossing, but anchored enough to suggest a narrow chance. And he knew immediately that hesitation would remove even that, because water was already gnawing at the trunk's base. And he turned to Caleb with a voice that left no room for doubt, telling him they would cross now, one at a time, low and balanced. Caleb moved first, crawling along the slick bark with careful precision, fingers gripping rough patches where the outer layer had split, the current below surging against debris and spraying mist upward. And Daniel watched every inch of progress, calculating how much longer the trunk might hold under shifting pressure. And when Caleb reached the far side and rolled onto solid gravel, he turned instantly, eyes wide but steady, ready to guide his father with words rather than panic. Daniel began crossing just as the trunk shuddered, a subtle movement that signaled erosion at one end, and halfway across he felt the wood flex beneath his weight, heard the grinding sound of its lower base loosening from saturated soil, and for a fraction of a second the image of failure flashed through his mind, not dramatic but precise. The fall, the current, the separation, and he pushed that image aside with pure will, focusing only on the next handhold, the next breath, the next shift of weight. He reached the gravel as the trunk tore free behind him, spinning into the flood and vanishing downstream. The crossing erased instantly, and for several seconds neither of them moved, both understanding how narrow the margin had been, how close they had come to being claimed in the final stretch. And then from beyond the bend of the fire road came a sound that did not belong to water or wind, a low mechanical growl rising and falling unevenly. A National Park Service truck rounded the curve slowly, tires cutting through runoff, a ranger scanning the damaged road ahead, and when he saw them standing there, mud-streaked and unsteady, he braked hard, stepping out into the mist with an expression that shifted from caution to recognition of what they had endured. And Daniel felt his knees weaken not from injury, but from release, the kind that arrives only after sustained restraint. And as Caleb finally allowed himself to breathe without bracing for the next collapse, the mountain behind them continued to move and settle, but its grip on them was finished. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.